Empty classrooms and empty playgrounds in nursery schools. It's pretty much the same picture around the world. To curb the number of coronavirus infections, schools and kindergartens remain shut. When can they open again? And if so, under what conditions? That's the question most parents ask. Children need an education, but they also need to be protected from the virus. A difficult balancing act. Welcome to our COVID-19 special on DW News. I'm Monica Jones in Berlin. Good to have you with us. It's 2021, and the pandemic still dictates our life, and that of our children, of course. Now there's talk of prolonging the lockdown. Again, no school, no kindergarten. But are kids really at risk? A recent study implies yes, they are.
Children are generally not considered to be driving the spread of the coronavirus. But researchers in Munich analyzed blood samples from 12,000 children, and what they found has them worried.
We examined children for antibodies against the coronavirus, and we found that around 6 times as many children had had the infection as would have been expected. This study shows us that children definitely do get infected, and that they can take the infection home with them.
That so many of the samples from the children tested positive came as a surprise to Professor Ziegler, who headed the study. She thinks that in many cases, the children only had mild symptoms or none at all, so the infection wasn't detected.
At first, we had no idea what the rate of undetected cases was, but now we see that it's 6 times higher. That can reflect the fact that children tended not to be tested as often, so the number of cases was underestimated.
That children often don't get tested is something this father experienced. When COVID-19 broke out in his son's daycare center, it was mainly the educators who got tested. The children were just sent home to quarantine.
I have to say that I was concerned. So we decided to play it safe and have the children and ourselves tested, so as to have certainty.
It turned out that both his children had indeed been infected, even though they exhibited no symptoms. Nevertheless, the local health authority didn't have all the other children in the daycare center tested. Jürgen Hastenberg says it should have.
I think
it was a big mistake not to test the children, apart from my 2. I was basically the only one in quarantine. The parents of the 90 other children continued to go to work, and they may have spread the disease without knowing it.
Another thing Hastenberg can't understand is that although adults are being told to not meet up in their free time, in the daycare center, all the children are in one big group rather than in small groups. Of course, not every risk can be eliminated, says Professor Ziegler, who carried out the Munich study. But she says that if the government wants to keep schools and daycare centers open as long as possible, they have to institute stricter hygiene rules.
We have to assume that children definitely also get this disease, and I think that we have to take more precautionary measures in schools and daycare centers. The same rules, smaller groups, social distancing, hygiene, ventilation, should apply there too, just like everywhere else, because children also contribute to the spread of the infection.
So that means that at present, adhering to strict hygiene rules and carrying out more COVID tests in suspected cases is probably the best way to keep infections in daycare centers to a minimum.
And for more, I'm joined now by Donna Farber, professor at the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Columbia University. And she's also the co-author of an article on distinct antibody responses to SARS-CoV-2 in children and adults across the COVID-19 clinical spectrum. And she conducted a study called Children's Untrained Immune Response Seems to be Key to Eliminating SARS-CoV-2. a lot to talk about here, and that would be the very first question. So from what we've heard, children infected with SARS-CoV-2, they often don't show any symptoms. Why is that?
Well, there could be two main reasons for that. One is that the virus just doesn't infect as well. So there might be something about the cells in the respiratory tract of children that are different, that just don't allow as productive of infection. So we still don't know whether that might be a reason. The other is that the children mount a very effective and robust immune response and are able to clear the virus before they get severe symptoms.
I mean, a child's immune system still has to learn a lot as opposed to that of an adult, if I understand that correctly. And
right.
T cells seem to play a key role here. Kids are better equipped, it seems. Why is that?
Well, children are designed to respond to new pathogens because they have a whole arsenal of T cells that are new T cells that have the ability to respond to new pathogens. These are called naive T cells, and children are producing these all the time. Whereas adults don't have many naive T cells because we've generated memory over our lifetime and we aren't producing new T cells anymore. So children are well adapted to respond to new pathogens. They have these new T cells, they mount a robust response. However, adults only have memory cells or they have mostly memory cells, so they're going on what they've seen before. So normally, adults are better equipped to respond to pathogens that they've seen many times, like influenza or RSV. So compared to a child, adults are responding much more effectively. They don't get as sick because they've seen these over time, have built up these memory responses which provide protective immunity, whereas children don't. But now we're looking at a situation where both the children or adults are seeing a new pathogen. And now the children have all the T cells and the new T cells to respond, where adults are not, they do not have as many new T cells to respond.
But do children
so
also have,
as well.
Right, do they also have an advantage when it comes to the long-lasting effects of COVID-19? And we've heard with adults that there are cases of heart failure, other long-term health issues they have to deal with, even when they were hardly ill when they actually had COVID-19. What do we know about children so far?
Well, I mean, we know that there seems to be some long-lasting effects of COVID-19, even from adults that weren't hospitalized initially. And there's certain coagulation defects, and it could be due to the very strong inflammatory response. We know that there's a lot of markers and mediators of inflammation that this virus seems to stimulate. In children, that can also happen. So the severe disease in children, there is one manifestation which is called multi-inflammatory syndrome in children. And that can potentially cause long-lasting effects, although thus far follow-up has not shown that these children really have long-lasting effects. So initially they were presented with sort of cardiac heart problems. But so far, this hasn't shown to be long-lasting. About the coagulation defects, certainly young adults have shown that and have actually developed strokes. But in terms of babies and young children, there's just not enough evidence to suggest that that's also happening in children.
So just very briefly, yes or no, basically, because there's this big discussion about reopening schools and kindergartens, yes or no. Should we or shouldn't we?
I mean, I think we need to, but we need to protect the children in terms of, I mean, we need to still be wearing masks and have these precautions in schools, but it would be better to open it because they don't seem to be the super spreaders.
All right, Professor Farber there from Columbia University, joining us from New York. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Well, thank you.
Well, time for your questions now. And over to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
Is it possible to test positive for COVID-19 and its antibodies at the same time?
Tricky question. To answer it, we need a quick refresher on the terminology. Antibodies are immune system proteins that can be detected by what are called serological tests, generally from blood samples. If you have antibodies that are specific to COVID-19, that indicates that you were exposed to the coronavirus at some point in the past, whether you developed symptoms or not. Diagnostics like antigen and PCR tests, on the other hand, are for detecting the virus or its genetic material. So they're supposed to tell you whether you have an active infection. This question, therefore, basically boils down to, can I have an active infection, yet at the same time be producing detectable amounts of antibodies against it? Yes, you can, but finding both involves getting the timing right. That's because there's some overlap between when an infection is in full swing and the ramp up of the body's immune response. In general, experts say it takes a patient's body between 1 and 3 weeks to produce detectable amounts of the different antibodies that play a key role in fighting off COVID-19. Researchers in New York found that even patients producing antibodies in those measurable amounts, however, could continue to test positive for the virus for up to 4 weeks after their symptoms resolved. What the team couldn't determine, though, was whether that viral genetic material was actually coming from active, viable virus. PCR testing doesn't tell you that, although that's really what you want to know. It just tells you whether there are intact pieces of viral RNA in a sample.